At its peak, Kango was the British word for an electric breaker. The way Hoover means vacuum, Kango meant demolition. The Ministry of Defence bought them. British Rail bought them. 11 kilograms of all-metal engineering, built on Lombard Road in southwest London. Then the ownership changed. A Swedish firm bought it for £7.8 million, with a promise that production would stay in Britain, then shipped the tooling to Germany. A Hong Kong conglomerate bought the name as part of a $600 million portfolio. The Lombard Road Works is a business park now. The name survives on packets of drill bits in B&Q, not through one disaster, through 4 owners in 30 years, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it. Chapter 1. The Hammer That Plugged In. The story begins with a line in a trade journal that almost nobody alive today has read. On the 26th of June, 1925, The Engineer, the weekly Bible of British mechanical industry since 1856, published a description of an electrically operated hammer, manufactured by a small new firm called Kango Co. Ltd., registered at 78 Petty France, Westminster, with works at the Morden Factory Estate in southwest London. The firm had been incorporated that same year. Its founders' names have not survived in any publicly accessible record, a gap that is itself a small tragedy. Because whoever they were, they solved a problem that had plagued the British construction industry since the age of steam. In 1925, if you needed to break concrete or demolish masonry on a British building site, you had 2 options, and neither was good. The first was a man with a sledgehammer, and the limitations of that approach are obvious. The second was a pneumatic breaker, a compressed air jackhammer that required a petrol-driven compressor, a length of heavy rubber hose, and a generator to power the compressor if the site didn't yet have mains electricity. The compressor alone weighed more than a ton. The hose kinked. The whole arrangement demanded at least 2 men to operate and a flatbed lorry to transport. It worked, but it was slow to set up, expensive to hire, and impossible to use inside a building without suffocating everyone in the room with exhaust fumes. What Kango proposed was something genuinely new, a handheld electro-mechanical breaker that could be plugged into a building site's 240-volt mains supply. No compressor, no hose, no generator. 1 cable, 1 tool, 1 man. The electric motor drove an internal piston mechanism, a crank converting rotary motion into reciprocating hammering force, and the operator simply held on while the machine did the work that had previously required either a pneumatic rig or brute physical strength. It is difficult, a century later, to convey how radical this was. Britain in 1925 was rebuilding. The empire was at its territorial peak. London was expanding outward in every direction. New housing estates, new underground stations, new arterial roads that would need foundations cut into London clay. The construction industry ran on muscle, steam, and compressed air, and the transition to electrification was only beginning. Black & Decker wouldn't start manufacturing in Britain until 1928, when the American firm leased a facility in Slough and began making portable electric drills. Hilti, the Liechtenstein firm that would eventually dominate the demolition hammer market, didn't exist yet. Wolf Electric Tools, also a London firm, had been founded in 1900 by S. Wolf, but Wolf made drills and grinders, not breakers. Nobody was making a handheld electric demolition hammer. Kango was first. The Morden Factory Estate sat just south of the river, in an area of light industrial works that stretched along Lombard Road in what is now SW19, Merton, on the border with Wimbledon. It was the kind of South London landscape where engineering firms nested among terraced housing and railway sidings, close enough to the river wharves for deliveries and close enough to the expanding suburbs for labour. The works was modest. In 1925, every British manufacturing story starts modest. What mattered was not the size of the factory, but the size of the idea, that electric power, applied to a reciprocating mechanism inside a housing a man could carry, would replace a system that required a truck, 2 men, and a compressor. And it worked. Not immediately. The early models were crude by later standards, heavy even by the heavy standards that Kango would become famous for, and limited in their hammering frequency by the materials and motor technology of the era. But they worked. A builder could plug a Kango into the mains, press the chisel point against a concrete floor, and watch the material come apart beneath him without the roar of a compressor drowning the sight. The noise was different, a harsh, metallic rattling that came through the casing and up through the operator's arms into his shoulders and spine. But it was a self-contained noise. One man, one cable, one hammer. The principle was so simple and so effective that it would sustain the company for 70 years. And then, gradually, and then completely, it would be taken away from them. Chapter 2. Lombard Road. By the late 1940s, the Morden factory estate works on Lombard Road had become something more than a manufacturer. It had become a verb. The transition happened the way these things always do, not through a marketing campaign or a branding exercise, but through repetition on 10,000 building sites across Britain. A contractor would hire or buy a Kango, and the apprentice would be told to Kango out that wall. The foreman would shout across the site to get the Kango on it. The health and safety officer, in the years when there were health and safety officers, would note that Kangoing had been taking place on the 3rd floor. The word entered the bloodstream of British construction the same way Hoover entered the household and Biro entered the classroom. It became the thing itself. You didn't use an electric demolition hammer. You used a Kango. Even when the hammer in your hands said Hilti or Bosch or Makita on the side, you called it a Kango. The Wikipedia article on jackhammers records the fact with the flat authority of an encyclopedia. In Britain, electro-mechanical versions are colloquially known by the name of Kangos. The genericized trademark, the moment when a brand name becomes a common noun, is simultaneously the highest honor a manufacturer can achieve and, ironically, the first step toward its own erasure. Because once the name belongs to everybody, nobody needs to buy the original to use it. But that irony was decades away. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Kango didn't just lend its name to the category, it owned the category. The post-war reconstruction of Britain was the largest building program the country had ever undertaken. Bomb-damaged cities rebuilt, new towns constructed from nothing, motorways driven through countryside that had never seen a road wider than 2 lanes. Every one of those projects needed demolition before construction. Every one of those demolition jobs needed breakers, and the breakers that British contractors reached for were Kangos. The models that came out of Lombard Road in this period would become the workhorses of an entire industry. The Kango 637 and 638, mid-weight demolition hammers, heavy enough to break concrete but light enough for a skilled operator to control on a vertical wall. The Kango 900, a heavy demolition breaker that could go through a reinforced floor slab the way a knife goes through bread, given time and a sharp chisel. And the machine that would become the definitive Kango, the tool that builders would still be talking about half a century later with the reverence other men reserve for vintage motorcycles, the Kango 950. The 950 weighed over 11 kilograms. Its body was all metal, a fully enclosed motor housing and gear case that could survive being dropped from a scaffold, kicked down a flight of stairs, and left in the rain overnight without complaint. Inside, a piston and striker assembly ran in heavy grease, the famous Kango grease, a lithium-based lubricant so specific to the machine that third-party suppliers still sell it today as a service kit item. The mechanism was brutal in its simplicity. An electric motor turned a crank. The crank drove a piston. The piston compressed air behind a free-flying striker, and the striker hammered the tool shank with a force that could be felt in the bones of your forearms, your elbows, your shoulders, and, if you used one for long enough, your lower back, your kidneys, and the cartilage between your vertebrae. By modern standards, the vibration was extraordinary, a white finger claim waiting to happen. Builders who used the originals are honest about this. The 950 would rattle your teeth, numb your hands, and leave you aching for days if you weren't used to it. But it would also go through anything. Concrete, brick, stone, tarmac, tile, the 950 didn't care, and it wouldn't break. The engineering beneath that metal casing was so overbuilt, so massively tolerant of abuse, that machines from the 1960s and 1970s are still in working order today, fetching £100 to £200 on eBay from builders who know exactly what they're buying. The tool shank was proprietary, a tapered fitting called the K-taper, predating the SDS standardization that would later dominate the industry. This was deliberate. A proprietary shank meant proprietary chisels and drill bits, which meant recurring revenue from consumables. It also meant that once a contractor had invested in a set of Kango chisels, switching to a competitor's hammer meant replacing the entire accessory kit. It was an engineering decision, and a business decision rolled into one, and it locked British building sites into the Kango ecosystem for decades. The engineers who made it all work were not household names then, and are not household names now. Norman J. Ince, of Hampton, filed patents through the 1960s and 1970s on rotary hammer drills with selectively disengageable percussion, the mechanism that let an operator switch between drilling and chiseling without changing tools. Christopher A. Vaughan worked on side handle ergonomics and vent aperture mechanisms. David Norman, William Badcock, and Andrew S. Carey Yard filed patents on the later 950 series refinements. These were the under-the-radar inventors who made the 627, the 637, and the 950 actually function, who solved the problems of heat dissipation, vibration management, and piston timing that turned a concept into a product. Their names appear on patent filings registered to the Lombard Road address. Their faces do not appear in any indexed public record. They built a tool that became a word, and they vanished. Chapter 3. The Test Bed and the Toolmakers. The sound of Lombard Road was the sound of hammering. Not one hammer. Dozens. Running simultaneously on the test bed, the section of the factory where every completed unit was powered up, loaded with a chisel, and driven against a block of concrete or stone until the engineers were satisfied that the piston timing was correct. The grease was distributed, and the striking force was within specification. A young lad walking through the gates for his first shift at Kango would hear the test bed before he saw it. A relentless, percussive wall of noise that vibrated the floor beneath his feet and the air inside his chest. One man who started as a lathe operator at Lombard Road in 1962 recalled the factory in terms that haven't faded after 60 years. The lathes were in one section, turning the motor shafts and gearcase components that would be assembled into finished hammers a few departments away. The smell was cutting oil and hot swarf, the spiraling ribbons of metal that peeled off the workpiece as the lathe bit into it, accumulating in trays beneath the machine until someone shoveled them into a bin. The cutting oil got into your clothes, your skin, the cuffs of your overalls. You could shower at the end of a shift and still smell it on your hands at tea time. The assembly floor was where the components converged. Stators and rotors from the winding shop, gearcase housings from the machining section, pistons, strikers, and tool holders assembled with the precision of a rifle bolt. Because the tolerances mattered. A striker that was a fraction of a millimetre out of true would hammer unevenly, overheat, and crack. The grease had to be packed into the piston chamber in exactly the right quantity. Too little, and the mechanism would run dry and seize. Too much, and the compressed air behind the striker couldn't build enough pressure to deliver full impact force. Then the finished units went to the test bed, and the noise began. An apprentice who started at Kango in 1966 and stayed until 1971 remembered the test bed with a mixture of awe and dark humour. He recalled the man who ran the hammers on the test bed, the operator whose job it was to hold each finished unit against a test block, feel the rhythm of the piston through his hands, and judge whether the machine was performing correctly. The apprentice called him the Death Man, and the nickname was only half a joke. The vibration exposure was immense. Modern regulations would have shut the test bed down within a week. In the 1960s, it was simply the job. He also recalled the assembly manager and his wife, a couple who, in his words, lived and breathed the company. This was not unusual for a British light engineering works of that era. The boundary between the factory and the family was permeable. People didn't work at Kango the way a modern employee works at a corporation. They belonged to it. Their identities were bound up with the product, with the knowledge that the hammers leaving Lombard Road would be used on building sites from Glasgow to Gibraltar, that British Rail ordered them, that the Ministry of Defence ordered them, that the royal household was rumoured to have a Kango in its maintenance stores. The factory's rhythm was the rhythm of shifts. Mornings began with the clocking in queue, men filing through the gatehouse, punching their cards, pulling on overalls. The canteen ran tea all day and a cooked breakfast for the early shift. The works hooter marked the start and end of each shift with a blast that carried across the surrounding streets. Lombard Road, Morden Road, the terraced houses where many of the workers lived within walking distance of the gates. The tram, the Wimbledon to Croydon tramlink, or rather its predecessor route, ran past the end of the road. A man could step off the tram, walk 200 metres, and be at his lathe within 5 minutes. A Finnish exchange student who worked at Lombard Road in the summer of 1968 on a Lions Club scholarship, took photographs. Those photographs, if they survive, would be among the only visual records of the factory floor in its working prime. The Finnish student came, worked a summer, returned to Helsinki, and kept the images as souvenirs of an English factory experience that probably seemed routine at the time and irreplaceable now. The materials that fed the factory arrived by road: castings, motor windings, raw steel bar stock for the lathes, copper wire for the stator coils. Small British engineering firms supplied many of these components. RGE Group, a specialist engineering outfit, worked closely with Kango in the mid-1980s on a demolition hammer designed to compete directly with Hilti. Evidence that even in the later years, Kango was still trying to innovate, still reaching for the next generation of tooling. The supply chain was local, or at least national. Castings from British foundries, gearings from British machine shops, motor windings from British coil winders. The Kango that left Lombard Road in a cardboard box, ready for a building site, carried inside it the work of a dozen small firms that most people had never heard of and never would. Chapter 4. The word on every building site. Jerry McGettigan started at Kango's East Kilbride depot in 1973. He was 16 years old. East Kilbride, a new town south of Glasgow, designated in 1947 as part of the post-war planned community programme, was where Kango maintained its Scottish sales and service operation. McGettigan's job put him on the front line of the Kango ecosystem. The depot received broken and worn-out hammers from building sites across central Scotland, repaired them, packed the grease, replaced the carbon brushes and piston seals, and sent them back out. He stayed until Atlas Copco bought the company 20 years later, and what he remembered, decades afterwards, was not the machinery, but the people. "Some great people," he wrote, in a public reminiscence that captures the tone of a workplace that functioned as a community. John Morley was the big boss, the senior executive who, in McGettigan's telling, drove a Ferrari to work. At 16, McGettigan was given the job of sorting a bracket onto Morley's car and washing it for him. It was the kind of task that in a modern corporation would be unthinkable, the chief executive's car being tended by the youngest employee. But in a mid-sized British engineering firm in the 1970s, it was simply how things worked. The hierarchy was steep but personal. The boss had a name. The apprentice had his hands on the boss's car. Everyone ate in the same canteen. In 1977, every member of staff at Kango received 2 commemorative coins for the Queen's Silver Jubilee, handed out by management. McGettigan kept his. Nearly 50 years later, he still had them. 2 small metal discs that proved he'd been there, that the place had existed, that someone in charge had cared enough to mark a national occasion with a personal gesture to every person on the payroll. The Jenkins brothers were another thread in the fabric. Brian, Bill, and John, 3 brothers, 1 family, 1 factory. Bill ran the repair shop. John was on reception. The details are sparse, but the pattern is unmistakable. Multi-generational, multi-sibling employment in a single works, the kind of arrangement that made a factory into something closer to a parish. You knew the people you worked with because you'd known them your whole life. Your brother was down the corridor. Your neighbour was on the next bench. Bob Riddell was a sales executive who would later manage the merged Kango Wolf operation, a man who bridged the old world and the new, who had sold Kango hammers on their own merit and would later find himself selling a combined product line that pleased nobody. His recollection of the customer base gives the clearest picture of Kango's reach in its prime. We supplied everyone from corner contractor to BR and MOD and Royal Household, British Rail, the Ministry of Defence, the Royal Household, and the bloke with a van and a transit full of chisels who knocked on doors in Lewisham offering to break up your old patio. The same tool, the same name, the same red and silver livery, serving the entire spectrum of British construction from the palace to the pavement. The Cage Code confirms the military connection. Kango Ltd held code U2050 as a registered UK Ministry of Defence supplier, a designation that meant the company had passed the procurement vetting required to sell equipment to the armed forces. Breakers and drills for military engineering units, tools for maintaining barracks, airfields, naval dockyards. The MOD didn't buy Kangos because the name was fashionable. They bought them because the tools were virtually indestructible and the supply chain was British. By the late 1970s, Kango occupied a position in British construction that was almost impossible to challenge from the outside. The genericized trademark meant that every electric breaker was called a Kango, whether it was one or not. The proprietary K-taper shank meant that contractors who'd invested in Kango chisels were locked into the ecosystem. The MOD and BR contracts provided a steady baseline of institutional revenue. The reputation for indestructibility meant that second-hand Kangos held their value and that first-time buyers trusted the name without hesitation. The engineering patents filed by Ince, Vaughan, Badcock and Carey Yard meant that the technical refinements, the selectable percussion, the improved ventilation, the ergonomic side handles, stayed ahead of the competition, or at least level with it. And beneath all of this, something less tangible but equally important. The builders trusted Kango because Kango was British, not in a flag-waving, jingoistic sense. In the practical sense that mattered on a building site in 1978, the spare parts came from a depot in East Kilbride or a warehouse in Peterborough, not from a distributor in Stuttgart or a shipping container from Yokohama. When a carbon brush wore out, you phoned a British number, and a British van brought the replacement. When a piston seal failed, the repair manual was written in English by engineers who understood British mains voltage, British site conditions, British weather. The supply chain was domestic. The knowledge was domestic. The jobs were domestic. This was the summit. Not a single dramatic peak. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. No record-breaking production run. No royal visit with a plaque unveiled. Just a long plateau of dominance, stretching from the mid-1960s through the late 1970s, during which Kango was so completely embedded in British construction that imagining a building site without one was like imagining a British kitchen without a kettle. Chapter 5. The Summit Before the Cliff. The late 1970s were the years when everything still worked, and nobody could see why it wouldn't continue. Kango's Lombard Road factory employed skilled workers whose knowledge of the product was measured not in training modules, but in decades. The apprentice who'd started in 1966 was now a time-served engineer. The lathe operators who'd been turning motor shafts since the early 1960s could feel when a cut was 1/1000th of an inch off true, because they'd made the same cut 10,000 times. The testbed operators knew the sound of a correctly timed piston, the way a piano tuner knows middle C, by instinct refined through repetition until it was indistinguishable from talent. Norman Ince was still filing patents. The 950 was still the dominant heavy breaker in Britain. The 426 SDS rotary hammer, a newer, lighter design intended to compete with the Continental SDS Plus standard that Bosch had been pushing since the early 1970s, was in development or early production. The product range covered everything from light rotary hammer drills to heavy demolition breakers weighing more than the apprentice's toolbox. Kango claimed market leadership in the heavy end of the electric hammer market in the UK, a claim that Atlas Copco would later accept at face value when they wrote the check. But the late 1970s were also the moment when the forces that would destroy Kango were already assembling, just beyond the edge of what anyone at Lombard Road could see. The first force was Bosch. The German tool giant had introduced the SDS chuck system in 1975, a standardized, tool-free bit retention mechanism that would eventually replace every proprietary shank system in the industry, including the K-taper. SDS meant that any manufacturer's drill bits and chisels would fit any manufacturer's hammer. It was elegant, universal, and lethal to Kango's lock-in strategy. The K-taper had kept British contractors buying Kango consumables for decades. SDS would set them free. The second force was Hilti. The Liechtenstein-based firm had been expanding aggressively into the UK market since the 1960s, with a direct sales model that bypassed the traditional tool hire and builder's merchant distribution system. Hilti representatives arrived on building sites with demonstration kits, offered trade-in deals, and pushed a product range that was lighter, more ergonomic, and, crucially, designed from the ground up for the SDS standard. Where Kango's heavy metal casings were built to survive decades of abuse, Hilti's newer designs were built to be replaced on a shorter cycle, with lower upfront costs and a service network that made replacement painless. The third force was the one that nobody at Lombard Road had any control over, the corporate ownership structure that had swallowed Kango whole. Because by 1969, Kango was no longer an independent company. It was already inside Dobson Hardwick, a holding group that in March 1969 merged with William Park & Co. to form Dobson Park Industries. an engineering conglomerate whose core business was not power tools, but coal mining equipment. Dobson Park had 60% of the National Coal Board's business for powered roof supports, which in turn accounted for 60% of the NCB's capital spend underground. Power tools were a secondary holding, a sideline, a line item on a balance sheet dominated by pit props and hydraulic jacks. This was the conglomerate trap, the structural betrayal that would play out over the next 2 decades, not through malice, but through indifference. Kango didn't need rescuing in 1969. It needed investment in SDS compatibility, in lighter materials, in the kind of ergonomic redesign that Hilti and Bosch were pouring resources into. What it got instead was a parent company whose attention and capital were consumed by the coal industry, an industry that was itself heading for a collision with government policy that would make everything else irrelevant. The summit, then, was real. The dominance was real. The skill on the factory floor was real, but the ground beneath it was already hollow, and in 1982, the first crack would appear. Chapter 6. The Conglomerate Trap. In 1982, Dobson Park Industries bought Wolf Electric Tools. Wolf was a name that carried its own weight in British manufacturing. Founded in 1900 by S. Wolf, the company had grown from a small London electrical firm into a royal warrant holder with 850 employees at its Hanger Lane works in North London, a figure confirmed in a history of the county of Middlesex, published that same year. Wolf made portable electric drills, grinders, sanders, and a popular range of DIY tools that had become staples in British garages and workshops. The Sapphire pistol grip drill, launched in its Mark IV version in 1981, was the last genuinely new Wolf design. It was also, though nobody knew it yet, the last product that would ever be developed inside the Hanger Lane factory. Dobson Park's logic was straightforward, at least on paper. Merge Kango's demolition hammer expertise with Wolf's consumer and light industrial range. Create a combined firm, Kango Wolf Power Tools Ltd., with a product line stretching from DIY drills to heavy breakers. Consolidate overheads, rationalize production. The language of conglomerate management in the early 1980s was a language of efficiency, and efficiency meant fewer factories making more products under one corporate roof. Geoffrey Wolf, the family member who sold the firm, may have had his own reasons for letting go. The power tool market in 1982 was changing fast. Japanese manufacturers were pushing into Europe. Bosch was dominant in the mid-range. Black & Decker had established itself as the household name in consumer tools. A family firm with 850 employees and a single factory in North London faced a future that required either massive investment or a sale. Geoffrey Wolf chose the sale. The merger was announced. The combined entity was incorporated as Kango Wolf Power Tools Limited, and almost immediately the people who worked for Wolf began to understand what rationalization meant in practice. An apprentice who'd trained at the Hanger Lane works from 1973 to 1978, who'd learned his trade on Wolf machinery and taken pride in the royal warrant that hung in the reception, described the merger in terms that left no room for ambiguity. "I got the feeling it was an asset stripping exercise," he wrote, in a public forum post that carries the quiet fury of someone who watched a good firm dismantled. The Wolf product range was not integrated alongside Kango's. It was thinned. Models were discontinued. The consumer tools that had been Wolf's bread and butter were deemed redundant in a combined portfolio that Dobson Park wanted to focus on the professional and industrial end of the market. The lightweight stuff, the drills, the sanders, the jigsaws that ordinary people bought from hardware shops, was allowed to wither. On the 19th of July 1984, a corporate restructuring was recorded on US patent assignments. Kango Electric Hammers Limited was renamed Precis 188 Limited, and its intellectual property was assigned to Kango Wolf Power Tools Limited. The company number shuffle was a bureaucratic maneuver, a way of preserving brand names while consolidating patents under a single entity, but it carried a symbolic weight that no one in the legal department was thinking about. The name Kango Electric Hammers, the name that had been on the side of the Lombard Road works since 1925, was now a shell, a holding designation, a line in a solicitor's ledger. By March 1988, the rationalization was complete. The firm was renamed simply Kango Limited. Both London factories were closed. The Hanger Lane Wolf Works was demolished. The Lombard Road Kango Works, the Morden factory estate where the first electric hammer had been built 63 years earlier, was shut. The entire combined operation moved to Peterborough. The Wolf factory site at Hanger Lane would eventually be occupied by a McDonald's restaurant. Multiple former employees have confirmed this with the weary precision of people who've had to explain the same grotesque detail more than once. The place where 850 people had built Royal Warrant-holding electric tools was replaced by a fast food franchise. If there is a more succinct image of British industrial erasure, it hasn't been photographed. The Lombard Road site became Lombard Business Park, an estate of small office units occupied today by firms such as Tableau Display, End-Frame Productions, Atom Grip Services and Relium Lantard. Merton Council's published ratepayer list confirms the tenants. There is no plaque, no heritage marker, no indication that the building where Kango entered the English language as a common noun ever existed on this plot of land. The nearest tram stop is Morden Road, 215 metres away. A person could walk past the site every day for a decade and never know what had been there. Meanwhile, through the 1970s and into the mid-1980s, Dobson Park's core business was collapsing. The company had 60% of the National Coal Board's spend on powered roof supports, and the NCB was at war. The 1984-85 miners' strike tore through the coal industry like a seismic event, and when it was over, the programme of pit closures that followed destroyed Dobson Park's primary revenue stream. The conglomerate that had swallowed Kango and Wolf as diversification plays, as hedges against the risk of overdependence on mining, found that the hedges weren't enough. Grace's guide records that Dobson Park diversified into electronic control systems, toys and plastics in a vain attempt to find a source of growth. Toys and plastics. The parent company of Britain's most iconic demolition hammer brand was selling toys. The combined product range at the Peterborough factory was, by 1988, showing its age. The Kango 426 SDS drill, the 627 and 637 hammers, the 900 and 950 breakers, all carried forward from designs that were a decade or more old. The lightweight consumer tools that might have kept Wolf's market share had been discontinued. To fill the gaps, Kango Limited bought in planers, jigsaws and belt sanders from Holz-Herr in Germany and badged them with the Kango name. An outsider looking at the product catalogue would have seen a full range. An insider knew that half of it was somebody else's machinery with a Kango sticker on the side. By 1992, a former employee's assessment was blunt. The lightweight stuff they were selling was pretty much what they were selling in 1982. 10 years of conglomerate ownership, 10 years of rationalization, and the product range was frozen in time while Bosch, Hilti, Makita, and DeWalt poured investment into lighter materials, SDS compatibility, vibration reduction, and the ergonomic standards that health and safety regulations were beginning to demand. The Kango 950 was still indestructible. It was also still 11 kilograms of vibrating metal in an era when competitors were offering tools that did the same job at 8 kilograms with half the vibration exposure. The trap had closed. Dobson Park's mining revenue was gone. The power tool range was stale. The factory had been uprooted from London and replanted in Peterborough, losing institutional knowledge and local supply chains in the process. And somewhere in Stockholm, a Swedish engineering conglomerate was watching. Chapter 7. The Swedish Promise. On the 20th of May 1993, Atlas Copco AB of Sweden bought Kango from Dobson Park Industries for approximately £7.8 million. £7.8 million, for a company with an annual turnover of £20 million. For a brand that claimed market leadership in the heavy end of the UK electric hammer market. For 300 employees, a factory, a product range, a customer base that included the Ministry of Defence and British Rail, and a name so deeply embedded in British construction vocabulary that it had become a generic noun. 7.8 million was less than 40% of 1 year's revenue. It was the price of a modest office building in central London. It was the price that a distressed conglomerate accepts when it needs to raise cash, and the buyer knows it. Construction News reported the deal on the 27th of May, 1993, with the factual restraint of a trade publication that had seen enough acquisitions to know what they usually meant. Kango, the British manufacturer of handheld power tools popular in construction, has been bought by Swedish machinery maker Atlas Copco from parent company Dobson Park Industries for about $7.8 million. The article noted the turnover, the market leadership claim, and the workforce of 300. And then it printed the promise. Production of Kango's hammers and drills will continue at factories in Wimbledon and Bedford. The administrative and research headquarters will stay in Peterborough. That was the public commitment. British factories, British headquarters, British production. The Swedes had bought a British brand, and they were going to keep it British. The promise lasted less than 7 years. What happened next was not sudden. It was not announced in a single press release or explained in a single board meeting. It was progressive, a word that, in the context of industrial decline, means slow enough that nobody can point to the exact moment it became irreversible. Atlas Copco's primary interest in Kango was not the factory, the workforce, or the Peterborough headquarters. It was the brand and the product designs, the intellectual property that could be manufactured anywhere by anyone with the right tooling. Atlas Copco already owned AEG power tools, based at a factory on Max-Eichstrasse in Winnenden, near Stuttgart. The Winnenden plant was the heart of Atlas Copco's European power tool operations, building AEG-branded tools for the continental market. It had modern production lines, German engineering expertise, and a workforce accustomed to the high-volume manufacturing that Atlas Copco's global distribution network demanded. The transfer began quietly. Kango designs were sent to Winnenden. Tooling was shipped. Engineering drawings were translated from the specifications of British manufacturing into the standards of German production. The heavy all-metal Kango casings, the housings that builders had trusted for their sheer indestructibility, were redesigned in lighter materials, compatible with the AEG production line. The livery changed. The old red and silver British Kangos gave way to yellow and black German-built units that looked more like AEG tools than Lombard Road originals. The Peterborough factory continued operating, but the writing was visible to anyone who cared to read it. The new Kango designs, the ones intended for the future product range, were being developed in Winnenden, not Peterborough. The products still being built in Peterborough were the legacy models, the 900s, the 950s, the MOD spec breakers that were manufactured against existing government contracts. Once those contracts were fulfilled, there would be no reason for the Peterborough factory to exist. The Wolf tooling, the dies, moulds and jigs for the big gut-buster drill that had been Wolf's signature product, was shipped not to Winnenden, but to India. Raleigh Wolf, a licensed manufacturer, continued building Wolf pattern drills for the Indian and developing world markets. The tooling that had been used by 850 workers at Hanger Lane was now producing clones on the other side of the world. The knowledge that had built them had been scattered across 2 continents. In the late 1990s, the precise year has never been confirmed in any indexed public source, the Peterborough Kango factory closed. The MOD orders had been completed. The production lines had been transferred to Winnenden. The 300 employees who had been there at the 1993 acquisition were gone. Whether they left in a single redundancy round or were thinned out gradually over several years, whether the union, most likely the AEEU, negotiated a deal or fought a rearguard action, whether the local MP raised the matter in Parliament or let it pass in silence, none of this is on the public record. The Peterborough Evening Telegraph almost certainly reported it, but the Peterborough Evening Telegraph's archive is behind a paywall at the British Newspaper Archive, and nobody has digitised the relevant issues, and so the closure of a factory that employed 300 people in a town it had only moved to 10 years earlier has simply vanished from the accessible historical record. The promise, production will continue at factories in Wimbledon and Bedford, the headquarters will stay in Peterborough, had been broken in every particular. Production had moved to Germany. The headquarters had closed. Wimbledon was a business park. Bedford's role, if it ever had a substantial one, had ended. The British workers had been replaced by German workers, and the Swedish company that had made the promise was already planning its next move. Chapter 8. The distance grows. In September 2002, Atlas Copco announced a further restructuring of its electric tools division, led by its new president, Åke Sundby. About 150 assembly jobs were to be moved from the Winnenden plant to a new Atlas Copco subsidiary in Pilsen, Czech Republic. Winnenden would be repositioned as a competence centre for advanced manufacturing, research and development, which, translated from corporate restructuring language into plain English, meant that the factory floor was leaving, but the engineers were staying. This was the moment at which a Kango became, by any material measure, a Czech tool. Not British, not German. Czech assembled, German engineered, Swedish owned, wearing the name of a Westminster firm registered in 1925. The distance between the brand and the work was now measured not in miles, but in layers of corporate abstraction. A holding company inside a division, inside a multinational, inside a decision-making chain that started in Stockholm and ended in a factory where nobody had ever heard a builder say, "Get the Kango on it." The Winnenden restructuring also affected AEG-branded tools and the broader Atlas Copco power tool portfolio. Kango was one brand among several in a division that Atlas Copco was already beginning to regard as non-core. The power tool business generated revenue, but it didn't fit the strategic direction that Atlas Copco was pursuing: industrial compressors, mining equipment, heavy infrastructure machinery. Power tools were consumer adjacent. They required marketing to builders and retailers. They competed on price with Asian manufacturers who were getting better and cheaper every year. They were, in the language of corporate strategy, a distraction. And in Hong Kong, a man named Horst Julius Pudwill was building a company that specialized in exactly this kind of distraction. Chapter 9. $626 million. On the 30th of August 2004, Atlas Copco AB and Tektronic Industries Co. Ltd. announced a stock purchase agreement that would reshape the global power tool industry. TTI, founded in 1985 by Pudwill and Roy Chi Ping Chung, agreed to buy Atlas Copco's entire electric power tool and accessories business for $626.6 million in cash, debt-free. The deal encompassed Milwaukee Electric Tool Corporation, the American firm whose red and black tools were already dominant on U.S. construction sites. It encompassed Atlas Copco Electric Tools, GmbH, the Winnenden operation, including the AEG brand, the Drebo carbide drill bit line, and the Pilsen assembly subsidiary. And it encompassed Kango, the name of a company founded at 78 Petty France, Westminster in 1925. A company whose hammers had been tested on a noise-drenched bed in southwest London by a man his colleagues called the Death Man, whose silver jubilee coins had been handed to every worker by a boss who drove a Ferrari, whose products had been ordered by the Ministry of Defence and used on every major British construction project for half a century, was now an asset on the balance sheet of a Hong Kong-listed conglomerate whose corporate headquarters were at 24F, CDW Building, Tsuen Wan, New Territories. Pudwill told investors, "We are pleased to add the Milwaukee and AEG brands of power tools and Drebo carbide drill bits to our growing family of global brands." He did not mention Kango by name. Bob Freitag, TTI's North American Hardware Group president, called it a great day for Tektronic Industries. Daniel R. Perry stayed on as CEO of Milwaukee. The Kango brand transferred as part of the package, not as a headline acquisition, but as a line item, a legacy mark bundled into a $600 million portfolio alongside brands that TTI actually intended to invest in. The deal closed in early 2005. The legal entity Atlas Copco Kango Limited, company number 02813340, would eventually be wound down, and TTI began the work of integrating its new acquisitions into a global supply chain that manufactured in China, Vietnam, Mexico, Germany, and the Czech Republic. What TTI did with Milwaukee was, by any commercial measure, extraordinary. Pudwill and his team poured investment into Milwaukee's lithium-ion battery platform, building the M18 cordless system into the most successful professional power tool ecosystem in the world. By 2025, TTI's full-year results, announced in early 2026, reported record sales of $15.3 billion, growing 4.4% on a reported basis. Milwaukee was the engine. Milwaukee was the future. Milwaukee was where the research and development money went, where the marketing spend was directed, where the engineering talent was recruited. Kango was not Milwaukee. What TTI did with Kango was simpler, quieter, and, for anyone who remembered Lombard Road, devastating. The Kango name was preserved. TTI's corporate brand page lists it alongside Milwaukee, Ryobi, AEG, Empire, Imperial Blades, Stiletto, Hart, Hoover, Orek, Vax, and Dirt Devil. But the brand was repositioned. The larger breakers previously sold under the Kango name in Europe, the 500T, the 540S, the 545S, were re-engineered as Milwaukee designs wearing a heritage badge. Milwaukee Kango appeared on the tools, a compound branding that told the truth about where the engineering came from while trading on a name that British builders still recognized. These were not British tools. They had no design lineage to the Lombard Road originals. They were Milwaukee tools dressed in borrowed clothes. The rest of the Kango brand, the part that a consumer might encounter in a B&Q aisle or on an Amazon listing, was reduced to accessories: drill bits, chisels, masonry cutters, blades. TTI's own brand page copy describes the line with the cheerful sincerity of a marketing department that has never set foot on a building site. Kango accessories and hand tools have been engineered over a heritage that spans more than 100 years. We've invested heavily into manufacturing with high-grade materials like carbide and cobalt. High-grade materials. Carbide and cobalt. Manufactured in factories in China and Southeast Asia, shipped to warehouses in Europe, hung on pegboard displays in B&Q next to own-brand alternatives that cost £2 less. The name that had been the definitive word in British demolition, the name that was British demolition, that had been a verb on building sites from Inverness to Plymouth, was now a printed label on a packet of drill bits made on the other side of the world. Chapter 10. The Survivors. What survives of Kango in 2026 divides into three categories, and the distance between them tells the whole story. The first is the Milwaukee Kango range, professional SDS Max breakers engineered in Milwaukee's R&D facilities, manufactured to Milwaukee's specifications, sold through Milwaukee's European distribution network, with the Kango name attached as a regional heritage badge. These tools are excellent by any modern standard. They are also as connected to Lombard Road as a Toyota is connected to a Victorian bicycle shop. The engineering lineage runs through Milwaukee, not through Kango. The heritage is a marketing decision, not a manufacturing reality. The second is the Kango accessories line. Drill bits, chisels, and blades sold under TTI's Kango branding through B&Q, Amazon and trade counters across the UK. These are commodity items. They are manufactured to a price point. They compete with DeWalt, Bosch, Makita, and a dozen other accessory brands on the same shelf. The Kango on the packet does not mean that the product was designed, engineered, or manufactured by any organisation that has any connection to the firm that was registered at 78 Petit France in 1925. It means that TTI owns the trademark and has decided to use it. The third category is the one that would have mattered to the men who worked at Lombard Road, the surviving originals. On eBay and Gumtree, on DIY Not forums, and in classified listings pinned to the walls of independent tool hire shops, a quiet market persists. Working 110-volt Kango 950s sell for between £100 and £220, the 637s with chisels for similar money. The red and silver livery of the British-era originals, the colour scheme that preceded the yellow and black German production run, is the one the collectors want. A YouTube collector demonstrates a working Tater Red 637 and a red 950, handling them with the reverence of a man who knows exactly what he's holding and what it represents. Service kits are still available. Independent British suppliers, Tools 365, Drillfix, Solent Tools, sell replacement gaskets, piston seals, and the famous Kango grease for machines that left the factory 30 or 40 years ago. Carbon brushes are still mass-produced. The engineering was so overbuilt, the tolerances so generous, the materials so heavy, that a Kango 950 from 1978 can be stripped, re-greased, fitted with new brushes and seals, and returned to service on a building site tomorrow morning. It will still rattle your teeth. It will still numb your hands. It will still weigh 11 kilograms and vibrate like a pneumatic drill strapped to a washing machine on spin cycle. And it will still go through a concrete floor slab the way it did when the Silver Jubilee coins were handed out. Builders on the forums are honest about the contradiction. The originals are too heavy, too vibratory, and too noisy to be modern working tools. Health and safety regulations would shut them down on a commercial site in minutes. A modern Milwaukee SDS Max breaker does the same job at lower weight, lower vibration, lower noise, and with the cordless convenience that lithium-ion batteries have made possible. By every measurable standard, the new tools are better. And yet, There is a man in a yard somewhere in Doncaster who has a Kango 950 plugged into a transformer this afternoon. He's waiting for the grease to come up to temperature, because that's how they worked, the old ones. Cold mornings meant a slow start. The grease too stiff for the piston to hammer at full force until the friction of operation warmed the mechanism from the inside. He's standing in the rain, holding a tool that weighs as much as a small child, waiting for it to warm up. And when it does, it'll go all day. It went all day in 1975 and it'll go all day in 2026 because nobody at Lombard Road ever built one to fail. He probably calls it a Kango. Everyone does. Even the lad next to him holding a Makita. Chapter 11. The pattern Kango is not the only name. Wolf Electric Tools, Royal Warrant Holder, 850 employees at Hanger Lane in 1978, was absorbed into Kango under Dobson Park, its factory demolished, its site occupied by a McDonald's. The Wolf name survived. It was sold to a Nottingham firm and used to badge low-cost Chinese imports. You can buy a Wolf drill today. It has no connection to S. Wolf, to Hanger Lane, to the Royal Warrant, or to any of the 850 people who worked there. Spear and Jackson, founded in Sheffield in 1760 by draper John Love and Wakefield merchant Alexander Spear as Spear and Love, renamed in 1830 when apprentice Sam Jackson became a partner, made saws and hand tools for 2.5 centuries. The brand survives. Manufacturing has largely moved offshore. Record, the Sheffield maker of vices and planes, follows the same arc. Brand alive, manufacturing elsewhere. Black & Decker's UK design and manufacturing operations have been progressively consolidated into the American parent, Stanley Black & Decker, and the market that Kango pioneered, the electric demolition hammer, is now dominated by Hilti of Liechtenstein, by Bosch of Germany, by Makita of Japan, and by Milwaukee, which is owned by TTI of Hong Kong, which also owns the name Kango. In cordless professional power tools, Milwaukee is the market leader. The firm that bought Kango's name now leads the category that Kango created. The irony is so complete that it ceases to function as irony and becomes simply fact. The pattern is larger than any single company. When Kango's tooling was shipped to Winnenden in the late 1990s, it didn't travel alone. It took with it the orders that had sustained a chain of small British engineering firms, the foundries that cast the housings, the machine shops that cut the gears, the coil winders that wound the motor stators, the suppliers of bar stock and cutting oil and carbon brushes. RGE Group, who had worked closely with Kango in 1985 on a demolition hammer designed to take on Hilti, lost a customer. Every small firm in the Kango supply chain lost a customer, and when enough customers leave, the small firms close too, and the apprenticeships they offered vanish, and the skills they held are not passed on, and the ecosystem that made it possible for a firm like Kango to exist in 1925, the network of specialist British suppliers who could turn a design into a product without leaving the country, ceases to function. The Kango name on a B&Q chisel does not preserve any of that. It is a marketing term applied to a global supply chain. The chisel was manufactured in a factory that has no connection to Lombard Road, by workers who have never heard of Morden, for a corporation whose $15.3 billion revenue stream flows through channels that a Westminster firm registered in 1925 could not have imagined and would not have recognized. This is not nostalgia. Nostalgia would be a fondness for the past dressed up as analysis. This is something more specific, the documented, traceable, name-by-name disappearance of an industrial capability that took a century to build and a decade to dismantle. The workers who knew how to pack the grease into a piston chamber by feel. The engineers who could hear a mistimed striker through the noise of a test bed. The apprentices who learned their trade by standing next to men who'd been doing it for 30 years. The supply chain that ran from Sheffield foundries to South London assembly lines. All of it gone, replaced by a brand name on a pegboard in a retail shed. An original red Kango 950, weighing 11 kilograms, plugged into a transformer on a wet morning in 2026. Slowly warming up, the grease coming up to temperature inside the piston chamber, molecule by molecule, the mechanism loosening, the striker beginning to move. A builder, waiting, patient. He's done this before, and when it's ready, it will hammer. Not because anyone at TTI designed it to last this long. Not because anyone at Atlas Copco expected it to still be working. Not because anyone at Dobson Park or Kango Wolf or Precis 188 Limited, gave a moment's thought to what would happen to this particular machine 50 years after it left the factory, because someone at Lombard Road built it to work, and it does.